Did you know that since the late 1980s, vaccine manufacturers cannot be sued?
The vaccine makers have been protected by Congress under the Vaccine Injury Act. The anger and the rage that whites in my audiences I've attended, blacks and Latino mothers, they said, wait a minute, we can't sue them? I mean, even those that I have met that are pro-vaccine, when you let them know that the vaccine makers cannot be sued, even they say, wait a minute, I'm against what you're here for, but I ain't for that. You telling me that I can't sue the vaccine makers if it's proven that vaccine injured my child? I said, no. That's right. They're indemnified. You can't touch them.
One of the first red flags that scares me the most about vaccines is that they remove any potential for litigation against any damage from vaccines. What that tells you is that they don't have the science set up properly. The original vaccinations, the toxins, or whatever they wanted to call them, to try to put a tiny little bit of a disease into you so that that would get your immune system to become aware of that and used to that, and then therefore fight it off and be stronger. That principle is actually a fairly sound principle. But when it came to making money and getting everyone to get vaccinated for all manner of things when it wasn't required, it became a money scheme. As children, we were injected with all manner of poisons. I remember when I was a kid, I couldn't figure it out. One day my eye drooped. Remember my eye drooping? Directly related to a vaccination. My eye drooped permanently. Vaccinations are irresponsible the way that they're done. If they were responsible, if they made absolutely sure that there was no possibility of a negative side effect, and that if they didn't do their due diligence properly, that they could be litigated against, fair is fair. They don't do those things. There's so many red flags around vaccinations.
You have the vaccine manufacturers pretending that they were having production problems and going to Congress and saying, we need to upgrade our plant, our physical plant, to make more of this, but we're not going to spend the money because we're getting sued. And if we're going to get sued, if we're going to spend the money to make a product to get sued, it doesn't make sense for us business-wise. We're dropping out of the vaccine business. And all of the vaccine manufacturers went to Congress and told them, we're dropping out of the business unless you do something to make it so that we can stay in the business, which is where the Vaccine Compensation Program, the Vaccine Act, the Vaccine Court, the things that you've heard so many things about around this area over the past few days. That's where the whole idea came from. It came from the manufacturers who could no longer defend themselves, and Congress saying we need to protect the vaccine supply.
I think the choice at that time was was not an irrational choice by Congress, given the alternatives that they were presented. And the alternative was that I think the calculus was based upon the idea that at that point there was so much litigation against the vaccine companies that the pharmaceutical industry was considering abandoning vaccines altogether. Okay. So Congress, and I think vaccine companies went to Congress and said, we're going to stop making vaccines, and that's going to be a national security problem, because if there's a bioterrorism attack or if there is an epidemic, there's going to be no factories that are up and running that can create new vaccines that can respond to those national emergencies. And so if you want us to continue to make vaccines, you're going to have to give us immunity from litigation. And that's what happened.
If you're a surgeon, you can't go into the OR without liability insurance. What business do you know is allowed to practice and offer its service without liability insurance?
And what product that carries a risk of injury or death, what other product is mandated to be used by every single person born in this country multiple times? And there's no liability for anybody.
The vaccine industry has absolute legal immunity. In other words, they push all the risks of their toxic interventions onto the individuals, the families, the moms and dads. They take no risk whatsoever. And you know why? because they have legal immunity, and it means they have no reason to have quality control. They could put, if they wanted to, they could put radioactive cesium-137 into a vaccine and inject people with it and cause you cancer, and they would have absolute no liability whatsoever. They could put anything in a vaccine, and to some extent they do. They put known neurotoxins in the vaccines. It's criminal. It's criminal what they do to our fellow human beings.
The National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act that our organization worked on to try to get safety provisions in that law says that your doctor is supposed to keep a permanent record of every vaccine and lot number given. Your doctor is supposed to write down in a child's permanent medical record if there is a health problem that occurs that's serious, hospitalization and injury, and report it to the Federal Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System.
With no responsibility and legal immunity, basically, the companies that manufacture vaccines have no reason to have quality control. They literally can put whatever they want into vaccines. Barbara Loe Fisher's nonprofit organization, the National Vaccine Information Center, worked with Congress to pass the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986. This law included a centralized vaccine reaction reporting system, the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, or VAERS, VAERS, which is jointly operated by the Federal Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, and the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC. Let's have a listen to a few experts discussing the topic of adverse reactions to vaccines.
In the United States, we have the VAERS, Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. And this is the system that doctors or patients, anybody can report a possible vaccine reaction to. The reason it doesn't work is this, Ty. I'm a pediatrician. I should be seeing all these vaccine reactions, right? And you ask any pediatrician, how many vaccine reactions have you seen? I haven't seen any. I mean, a little bit of redness where the shot's given and some fever, we expect that. But no, I haven't seen any reactions. How can that be? Well, either there are no reactions or we don't know what to look for. I think it's the latter. So here's the thing. Kids will have seizures after vaccines and we'll say, oh, well, that's normal. Because you can have febrile seizures and that's a normal thing. We're taught that febrile seizures are normal. And are they? I don't know. Let's look at the unvaccinated and the vaccinated. Let's follow them and see, do the unvaccinated have febrile seizures as well? SIDS, I'm trained to think that that's just normal. We don't know what causes it, but it's normal. Well, let's look at the unvaccinated and the vaccinated and see if they both have the same amount of SIDS. Neurological problems, autism, which remember is the tip of the iceberg. What about all the ADD, the ADHD, the autism spectrum, the anxiety and the depression that we're seeing? And we're not even talking about all the autoimmune stuff we're starting to see at higher levels, diabetes type 1, and we're seeing way more allergies and eczema, and you're hearing more and more about people with peanut allergies that have to carry EpiPens around. Would that still be in that unvaccinated arm? Would they have all those same levels of these disorders, these chronic diseases that we're seeing in kids? I'd love to see this study be done. That's what we need to do.
I think there's a government-industry collaboration to promote vaccination. We know that government sees itself primarily as the promoters of the vaccine program, and they're supposed to also warn us about the risk. And by the way, they're supposed to, under the law, the legislation, the Vaccine Act, publicize the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. We know from a recent report from the Government Accountability Office that the people who are pushing the vaccines did not want to publicize it because they thought that conflicted. That's not me saying that, that's Congress. Congress commissioned a report, they said that, so they intentionally did not publicize the vaccine program. By the way, it's my statutory obligation as a lawyer who does this to promote the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. So we can consider this interview as promoting the statutory purpose of the Vaccine Act. And everyone in our country, especially the doctors who don't know how to recognize vaccine injury, should know that there's a vaccine injury compensation program, should be familiar with the types of injuries that occur, and be receptive to it, and report it to the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System so that we can monitor what's going on. That's not happening.
What we see on VAERS is not 1/10 of the injury, which is what the government says. The government says it's probably 1/10, right? It's probably 1/1000th. And I say that because I didn't know to report to VAERS. I ran a pediatric emergency room. I trained in pediatrics.
And you didn't know you're supposed to report vaccine injuries?
No, and we had in our ER when I was a medical student, a resident, and running the ER, we certainly saw kids, and I would moonlight at other hospitals even, that came in who had stopped breathing or had seizures after they'd been in the vaccine clinic. Nobody reported that. Nobody went and said this has to be reported.
Didn't even know?
No. It was kind of like we knew that happened, okay, but they didn't get reported. So think how many don't get reported.
Doctors are not taught what a vaccine adverse reaction looks like. In fact, when a parent calls the doctor and says, my child was vaccinated, I can't wake him up, he'll only wake up to feed, he's sleeping for 2 days, the parent is told that's normal. And when the parent raises the question, could this have been from the vaccine? Meanwhile, the kid had never done that before. The doctor almost unanimously says, no, it's just a coincidence. That kid suffered brain damage. Sleeping for 2 days as an infant, not waking up other than to feed, that kid was brain damaged. Had brain inflammation. Not waking up for 2 days other than to feed is a neurological event. That's not normal. And that's from the injection of material into the brain.
1989 is the year that this epidemic of childhood illnesses began. Autism, ASD, ADD, ADHD, speech delay, language delay, tics, something called misery disorder, which I've never heard of before. Tics is Tourette's syndrome and a family of grave neurological injuries that became epidemic that year. SIDS, narcolepsy, seizure disorders, things that, and of course food allergies and asthma. And all of those things began in 1989. On all of those illnesses, there's science today, there's science out there that indicates that those illnesses are being caused by thimerosal or adjuvants like aluminum or squalene or some other vaccine association.
Something is happening to the brains of our children. Something is interfering with the normal neurosequencing of brain development. Because when babies are born, their brain is not developed. When babies are born, they have more nerve cells than their brains need. And it's through life experience that the tracks are laid down to create the proper sequencing of muscular development, speech development, cognitive development, and emotional development. Something is interfering with the proper sequence of those steps. Something is getting in the way of the brain developing properly. No one is asking the question, why? Why are so many kids having an interference of the proper sequencing of brain development? Why, as of January 2016, are we seeing 1 out of every 20 children under the age of 5 with a seizure disorder?
Yeah, I believe that it's clear that the vaccines were the beginning of my downward spiral in my health, which became sort of a lifelong issue as far as bronchial asthma, as well as other health issues that emerged. So it was a very personal journey for me and advocacy, because I wanted to see, is the literature supporting the view that there are this many adverse effects that could occur? And it turned out, after spending 10 years looking at the research, I've got all of it on my website, there's actually over 200 adverse health effects that have been documented caused by vaccines in the schedule today.
VAERS. That's the acronym for Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. The name itself implies that vaccines are not totally safe because of the fact that there are admitted adverse reactions. After the legislation was passed that exempted vaccine manufacturers from liability, there was still a small loophole in the law that allowed for manufacturers to be sued. But even that small loophole was closed in 2011 with a Supreme Court decision.
You could still sue a manufacturer if you could show the manufacturer could have made a safer vaccine. In 2011, a case went to the Supreme Court, Brucewitz versus Wyeth. It was a DPT vaccine injury case. And the lawyers representing the pharmaceutical industry, government, and medical trade convinced the Supreme Court that there should be no liability at all for the pharmaceutical industry when it comes to vaccines that are licensed by the FDA as safe and effective. The Supreme Court majority, with 2 dissents, Justices Sotomayor and Ginsburg dissented. The Supreme Court said vaccines are unavoidably unsafe, and there shall be no more lawsuits against any vaccine company.
So legally, they're classified as unavoidably unsafe. That's their legal classification. And when I say that in court in these state, cases that I have, which are not injury, obviously that's federal court. The judges always stop me and go, "What? What did you say? Wait, repeat that. Yeah. Repeat that." And I'm like, "They're legally classified as unavoidably unsafe, Your Honor." And then they're like, "Whoa, wait a minute."
So today, if you or your child are injured by a vaccine or your child dies from a vaccine, you cannot hold anyone accountable in a civil court of law. Anyone who makes and sells the vaccine, who regulates the vaccine and who makes policy for the vaccine, who votes to mandate for the vaccine, or who gives the vaccine. The only one who's left with any responsibility of what happens to a child after that child's injured by a vaccine is the parent.
My son sustained a permanent brain damage. So there's a big inner struggle because you see that your child struggles with basic things that most children can easily do. That is learn language, learn how to speak, learn how to tell colors, comprehend more complex issues. So yeah, you do have guilt, but at the same time, if you didn't know in advance that was a possibility, and you blindly simply accepted something innocently that was told to you would be the best thing you could do for your child, you can't beat yourself up forever.
Over the course of my travels, I was able to interview many parents, including several attorneys, who could personally testify that the 2011 Supreme Court decision that vaccines are unavoidably unsafe was no joke, and that what happened to their child was proof.